everyone, and welcome to a bonus episode of Let's Take 5. A few days ago, Eric and I, were talking about the film Dr. Strangelove and how I learned to stop worrying and love the bomb. We are very honored today to have a special guest devote a half-hour interview to talk about a lot of the real-life implications of that film. And we are truly, truly honored to have Richard Lugar with us. He is a 6-term U.S. Senator from Indiana, and during that time he was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee and chairman of the Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. He was mayor of Indianapolis, and also, most notably, he has spent so much of his career working on nuclear dismantlement. And also, he is my great-uncle. Uncle Dick, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Austin.
It's truly amazing to be able to sit down and talk with you about this, because I don't know anyone else out there who's better equipped to talk about nuclear dismantlement.
Well, it's my privilege to respond to thoughts and questions that you have. Certainly, about 20 years of my Senate career was devoted to the so-called Non-Nuclear Cooperative Threat Reduction Act, which started back in 1991. And I would just say that each year we needed more money from the United States Congress to take down the warheads, the missiles, chemical weapons, the silos in which all of this was deposited in Russia and in the other countries that had nuclear weapons that were part of the Soviet Union, namely Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, for example. And this led to many interesting adventures back and forth to Russia and to the former states of the former Soviet Union, as well as to other countries who, of course, were deeply interested in this disarmament effort.
When we watched the film, I couldn't help notice really kind of how the film presented nuclear weapons, because although there are a lot of immoral characters in the movie, the biggest threat is always these really ominous and threatening weapons, what they can do. When you first began the process of wanting to be part of the disarmament program, what inspired you to be part of this?
I was inspired by the fact that serving on the Foreign Relations Committee from the time I got into the Senate, I was aware that the United States and the former Soviet Union were building nuclear weapons. The numbers were approximating 10,000 warheads, plus or minus a few, and all of the missiles and other aspects to the situation. It was going on, and yet at the same time, it was not really clear that anything was going to stop the buildup. Both nations saw the desire to have an overwhelming amount, and both were matching each other pretty closely. It was a period called mutually assured destruction, namely that there were enough warheads, specific warheads, to knock out every military installation in either country, as well as the cities of the country, all the major cities, the population areas. It was not really until fairly late that my curiosity consumed me, because I had been serving as mayor of Indianapolis prior to coming into the Senate. And during that period of time, I really was not aware that Indianapolis was targeted, that any one or two of the warheads could have virtually annihilated the entire city, much as Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been hit by the United States at the end of World War II in Japan. This was an awesome discovery as I went down into the silo where a big missile had been pulled out and with 8 warheads on it, and saw a desk down there with the guards, the Russian guards, had surrounding them pictures of American cities. And it certainly occurred to me that if we were on the firing end of that, that's one thing, but on the receiving end, total destruction. Unlike the Dr. Strangelove movie, essentially there would have been some people left in the United States, even after all of our military installations in our cities had been knocked out. And of course, all the infrastructure of the country, communication-wise and so forth. But there would have been some survivors who were not close to the cities and the military installations, and that would have been true in Russia likewise, although living in those circumstances would have been very problematical.
So I'm fascinated about that visit when you saw the marking of the cities. Why did they have that up when you were visiting?
They didn't prepare it for my visit. This was a time in which we were really taking away the missile out in Siberia. It was the fact that I gather was what the Russians saw as the targets of the particular warheads that were on the missile that was being pulled out. They called it a multiple reentry vehicle, meaning you could fire one missile and 8 different warheads would go to 8 programmed destinations from the single firing. And that's what the guards were down there monitoring throughout their tenure.
So when we're kind of looking at the mutually assured destruction, is that something, do you think that is like actually intended to be a military option, or is it just a fear tactic?
Basically a fear tactic, a tactic that said, if you fire at us, we will fire back, and the results will be awesome, so-called mutually assured destruction. The idea was that it was so awesome that no one would fire the first weapon. Of course, this led to extraordinary security arrangements, and Dr. Strangelove really illustrates that situation. The control, obviously, starts with the President of the United States, who has someone following him all of the time, even now, with a folder and at least whatever elements that he needs in the event that wherever he is, at whatever hour of the day or night, a decision needs to be made, he is in a position to make it. But nevertheless, the situation was one that called throughout this period of 40 years for somebody to get together and suggest perhaps a reduction of the number of these weapons would be desirable. They were very expensive to maintain, both in terms of the personnel involved and the various scientific principles that had to be observed. And yet there was a little movement toward those negotiations. Some attempts were made, but most promising came in 1986 when President Reagan was determined to try to proceed. He had some assurance from the Russians they wanted to negotiate in Geneva, Switzerland. And so President Reagan asked 16 members of the Senate, equally divided Republicans and Democrats, to go to Geneva, Switzerland in the summer of 1986. I was then either chairman or ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee, as part of that delegation, as were the heads of the Senate at that time, Senator Byrd of West Virginia and Senator Dole of Kansas. But also on the delegation were Senator Ted Kennedy and Senator Al Gore. Most important for me, one of the Democratic members was Senator Sam Nunn of Georgia, who was chairman of the Armed Services Committee during times that Democrats were in the majority in the Senate. And so we went to in 1986, and unfortunately, as it turned out, after a few weeks, the negotiations were not going to proceed. But Sam and I, during that time, met Russians over in the Russian consulate, and these were Russians with whom we were able to stay in touch during the next 5 years, because we traveled to Russia from time to time during recesses. We were in touch with them if they came to the United States or by other communication. I make that point because the critical moment came in 1991 when the Soviet Union was in the process of collapse. And a group of Russians, some of whom we had been visiting with over the years, came to Washington. They came to Sam Nunn's office. We sat around a round table, which I still have because After Sam left the Senate, I was able to roll it down to my office and now over to our Lugar Center office. We sat around that table, and a Russian, I can remember very starkly, looked me straight in the eye and said, "You folks in the United States have got a lot of problems." I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, some of the missiles with warheads that are aimed at you may be in danger because the troops that are guarding them are deserting. We're bankrupt in the Soviet Union. We can't pay anybody. So our military personnel are deserting. Sometimes they're stealing nuclear or fissile material or other things that they think they can sell to somebody to support their families." So I said, "Well, what do you want from us?" And he said, "We're going to need a lot of your money. We're going to need a lot of your scientists and technicians and engineers to help us take down the missiles and the warheads and the chemical weapons and so forth. We hope we don't need your troops, but we don't know what the situation is going to be in this very unstable predicament." So that was in late summer of '91. Sam Nunn and I, with the aid of Ash Carter, who just retired as Secretary of Defense, but was then at the Belfer Center of Harvard, and helped us in the drafting of legislation that would appropriate money, American taxpayer money, to take down the Russian weapons. $400 million was appropriated. A bill was passed in November of '91, signed by President Bush, by President Reagan 2 weeks later. And the Soviet Union collapsed 2 weeks after that. But in any event, that was the beginning of an attempt by the United States to work with Russians to help them, because if there was an accident with one of those nuclear weapons in Russia, the devastation there would be total. This whole problem of the disintegration and desertion was really awesome. But as I say, that was the beginning then of 20 years of work diligently with the Russians, and this required some arms control treaties passed by the United States Senate, in the meanwhile sort of setting the limits, setting the goals for the reduction.
So I have two questions about that meeting. The first one is, when Russia was asking for money, was that money for to go towards resources to dismantle the weapons, or was it money for something else?
It was money to dismantle the weapons. Very clearly, it was understood that Russia and the United States would be working together in Russia to dismantle the weapons.
And the other thing I wanted to ask was, when you're sitting at that table and you hear what they just said, what was your first emotion? Were you just horrified?
No, I was not horrified. I was surprised, to say the least. Clearly, since we had all been together 5 years previously, thinking about a treaty to reduce weapons, I was appreciative of the fact that we might be making some headway. What was difficult to understand was the degree of the desertions, the degree of danger that was then posed by the lack of control. I think, in the Dr. Strangelove movie, the idea always was that people would be in control of the situation, that somehow to the very last weapon, it could not be fired, destruction could not occur without the head of state or military officials or what have you. But here was a situation presented by the Russians in which you have a government which is in process of disintegrating. You have the people who are delegated, namely the guards around the missiles, who are deserting. And the question then is, what happens? Is there going to be an accident? Is there going to be an attempt to seal material? What happens?
So what was the most difficult thing as you try to figure out what happens? Where was the hardest thing to communicate with? What was the hardest step to get towards?
Well, clearly the steps that should be taken were that the United States military and civilian personnel ought to be in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, meeting with Russians and working on how we could get the transportation equipment in there, the various tools that would be required, and in essence, physically, how we could get together quickly to make certain not only that there were going to be guards, but that in a very proper, safe way, all of this dismantling could occur.
How long was it until the first weapon was dismantled?
I suspect that it was at least a year or two before a total dismantling of one of these situations. There is not a very good history day by day of that process because there were not note takers or people there doing accounting. This was sort of a dangerous business physically. But nevertheless, the next year, 1992, was difficult in a sense because in a way the president felt perhaps that he had not been consulted sufficiently about all of this, or the Defense Department. That this was coming up through the legislative calendar with two senators. And so as a result, Sam Nunn and I took some officials from the administration to Russia, to Ukraine, and to Belarus on a tour in which we all, as I've often said, got religion together. Everybody saw the dangers that were involved, and the Russians saw us. They saw that we were, in fact, reacting, and on a very appropriate, straightforward way, so that the contacts were very essential that way. So not much physically occurred during 1992, but it did move ahead, I believe, in 1993. There were some other events in 92. Specifically, Sam Nunn and I visited with the Russian leadership after the election. I keep getting confused as to who was president. It was President Bush at the time. He lost the election to incoming President Clinton. But in the process of all of this, Sam and I visited in Ukraine because the Russian leadership has said Ukraine now has these weapons independently. And we want you folks to go down there and tell them that they need to clean it up. So I went ahead with Sam to a dinner in Ukraine with President Kravchuk the first night we were there. And said President Kravchuk, the United States, is prepared to spend $100 million to help you take care of your nuclear weapons. I knew he wanted to get rid of them, although people in his legislative branch, the Rada, did not. They wanted Ukraine's prestige to be paramount by keeping weapons. But Kravchuk knew what dangers there were without proper guards and so forth. He rushed the two of us out to see a press corps that amounted just to two press in that day in Kyiv. And he said that Senator Lugar just offered Ukraine $150 million for our weapons. On the way back to the table, Sam said, "Dick, where did you get such a crazy idea?" And I said, "Easy, Sam, it's going to work out." And I went to see President Bush when we got back in the United States. I explained the whole thing to him. He was a very good sport about it. He signed a letter pledging $150 million to get rid of the Ukraine weapons. Oh, actually, by the time we finished, because there were so many in Ukraine, the expenditure was probably over the years closer to $800 million. But that started the process going. It brought confidence in the Russian situation that they were on the right track with us, as well as with people in Kazakhstan who didn't want to move until they knew what was going to happen in Ukraine.
Where did you come up with that number? Why 150 million?
Well, I came up with 100 million. It was Kravchuk that escalated the figure. I knew, given the number of weapons that were there and the estimates we had made with regard to weapons in Russia, that was a reasonable figure.
You know, you've now had these stories where you're in the room with these weapons, and I saw a photo at the lugarcenter.org of you opening a briefcase with a weapon inside. Was it always intimidating to be with things, or did it become normal, or did you always recognize the power of them?
I always recognized the power of the weapons, but at the same time, perhaps I wasn't callous to the thought of the destructive situation. It was just simply that, in a workmanlike way, there was no way to get the job done without going to these encampments, or sometimes down into caves where literally they were taking warheads before they could be dismantled. For example, I've already described the situation of a large missile in a silo that would be launched, and say 8 warheads would go in direction. Well, after the missile was taken out of the silo, the warheads were taken off of the missile. Now, immediately on those camps, there wasn't anyone there able to go into the warhead and safely take out the so-called fissile material, nuclear material, or other chemicals that were in the weapon. So in many cases, these warheads were placed in caves. They were almost like tombs for people. They were sort of lined up there in rows. And they awaited the time in which other scientists would come over, and engineers, and actually work on the dismantling of the warheads. Then the nuclear material went to a deposit in Russia where it was turned into material that could be utilized commercially and safely for heating purposes. The Russians, as a matter of fact, in due course, offered a great deal of this material to the United States, and the United States purchased it and utilized it for nuclear utilities. But this took time, and so each of these stages, of course, there were dangers, but perhaps you get used to dangers if you are in and out of this, at least as I was, maybe 3 times a year in trips to Russia or Ukraine or Kazakhstan or the other states.
And what was some more difficulties that you had as pushback as the 90s kind of went on?
Well, pushback sometimes came in debates in the United States Congress. After the initial excitement of the Non-Nuclear Act and the fact that warheads were being taken off of missiles and the rest of it under control, there were, of course, some members who thought that the United States was spending too much money in this situation, that there were domestic causes that really required more attention. And so this required debate on the Senate floor annually, some years more difficult than others. One year, and I cannot cite it specifically, but I remember vividly the situation, there were so many amendments offered. By that I mean people advising something had to happen before the money could be spent, that no money was spent during an entire year. The program literally came to a halt because of action in the United States Senate. But fortunately, that happened only on one occasion. In due course, Sam Nunn decided to leave the Senate, and so I was left to make certain each year that this all happened, and I took that responsibility very seriously.
I mean, and when you look at the film, just the mere presence of these weapons were always like signified as a fear. Do you think it was something about how like maybe the fear we had in the 90s kind of went down a little bit, and that's why it stopped becoming a priority to some people?
That could be, but I think likewise, the fact is that in our country we are primarily interested in domestic affairs, situations that occur right here in the United States. Many members of Congress are not focused on foreign policy or military policy. Those that are in the relevant committees, of course, are. But I simply mention there come times in which the world seems to be much more peaceful, and people do not appreciate perhaps the dangers that are still out there or the continuity of programs like the non-nuclear program. I understand that. There came a time in which, as a matter of fact, some members were indicating that because their constituents came first, they would say, I'm not going to spend any time abroad. I'm not even going to get a passport, so I can tell my constituents I'm focused right here. Um, and so we went through those sorts of arguments. Now, meanwhile, of course, the problem we're describing was still being solved year by year. It didn't all happen in the first 20 minutes. And I would just say that, fortunately, there were others in the Senate and in the House and in the administration, because we went through several presidents during the course of this period, who were very much aware of the fact that these weapons were still out there, and we had opportunities to continue to work with whatever government was coming along in Russia, and there were changes on that side too, time to time, to reduce the numbers. Now, during the course of time, I saw a chart not long ago that indicates that about 7,600 warheads had been taken down by 2013. That's about 4 years ago.
Wow.
That's a few more have been taken down subsequently, but the so-called New START Treaty was passed 2 or 3 years ago. This is the last arms control treaty between Russia and the United States. And that in itself is unfortunate, because it means that for the time being, the Russians want to retain about 1,500 warheads. And so do people in the United States. In our own Congress, there is debate right now as to whether we ought to modernize, in quotes, the warheads, or do other things to make sure that they work and so forth. So this is still an awesome question, but the 1,500 level is very different from the 9,000 or 10,000 level, which was overwhelming. And it is miraculous that in the course of this period of time, that kind of nuclear power has been reduced to the present situation.
To kind of wrap it all up, I'm hoping this isn't too simplistic of a situation, but it seems like that you really kind of believe that fewer nuclear warheads on both sides kind of makes the world safer, or what was your philosophy on that?
Yes, I believe that the reduction is important still. Now, I have never joined groups that write letters indicating that they favor zero nuclear. I understand very well, and I appreciate the idealism of that. But given the situation that we're having and the lack of willingness by the Russians to negotiate, for the time being, we really need to hold fast. There, I think, will be a time in which there will be a change possible, and certainly members of Congress and the President all look forward to that. But this does not appear to be that time. Likewise, in the meanwhile, there still are weapons in China, and there are weapons in Pakistan and India, and that's a very critical situation just in terms of the dangers posed by those two countries that have a quarrel over the area of Kashmir. And then, of course, there are the weapons that are left in Great Britain and France, and now the North Koreans, as we read, are conducting tests, attempting to develop a program. For the moment, Iran has stopped development due to the so-called Iran deal, which was very controversial but very important, I believe, to enact, which I supported. So it's a question, literally, of several different areas of work that are going to have to be done before the world becomes non-nuclear. But at the same time, any one of these warheads could create such destruction in terms of the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives, and quite apart from the demolition of cities and the whole infrastructure, that given the awesome power that's involved there, we have to be alert to possibilities for possible positive change.
Well, at the beginning of the show, I started off afraid, and then I became less afraid as I kept hearing about the wonderful things you did, and now I'm afraid again. But I think as we look towards the future, I think that all the work that you've done and the work that Senator Nunn has done and the work that all these countries have done can really lead the way towards even more disarmament and a safer world, truly. And I am grateful for all the work you've done, and I'm also very grateful that you've been able to talk about it here on the show.
Well, Austin, I thank you for giving me that opportunity, because it's an important issue. It has been for 20 years, but it will continue to be. And there may be hopefully people who are listening to the show, watching what you're doing, who will be inspired to move forward.
And you can learn a lot more about what Senator Lugar has done at thelugarcenter.org, as this issue has a great lot of information about it, as well as other issues that you've worked on. And I really encourage people to see the importance of that center. Once again, thank you, Uncle Dick, for being on the show. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you, Austin, once again, for giving me this great opportunity.
All right. We will see everyone else on a normal episode next Friday. Goodbye, everyone.